Welcome back to the conference. Please welcome the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research, Katherine O'Regan, Fred Freiberg, Shauna Smith, Marge Turner, and Kenya Robertson for the Testing for Discrimination, Strong Methods Build Stronger Cases panel.
Okay, so I have to admit, ooh, there you go. I've got a lovely cue card here to get me to turn the mic on the right way, and I just put my stuff down on top of it like, oh no, I don't need to know that. Welcome back from your break, and I congratulate you all for making it through 2 packed days, and I'm thrilled that you're here for the last panel of today on a very important topic, which is testing for discrimination. So before I turn to introducing the panel, I want to do a little bit of framing and putting this topic in historic context, and I have the benefit of building off of where we started today. So the U.S. Attorney General talked about the role of testing for discrimination, its historical role in this field, and a little bit of evolution, and that's what we want to talk about in this panel. And so I'm going to start with a little historical context, and then I'll explain how we're going to frame the panel as a moderated panel so that we can have a lot of conversation amongst the experts that we have up here, making sure that I save time for audience Q&A, which can always be lost in this. And my panelists are so interested in the conversation and have been participating in the conference the entire time that the first thing they said to me when I said, what do I have to make sure I get done at the end? They said, have time for Q&A. So let me start with just talking a little bit about the testing itself. Testing for discrimination tends to come in 2 forms, which is testing for enforcement purposes and testing for research purposes. But these 2 types have common roots and are really complementary purposes, right? They differ a bit in their immediate objectives in some methodological issues, but their relationship is really symbiotic, and you can see that over the series of decades on how they've supported each other and how portions of the methodology have moved on through one type of testing versus the other. Research and enforcement efforts leverage what's called paired testing, which the U.S. Attorney General talked about. It's a very powerful mechanism for revealing discrimination, in part because it's pretty intuitive. We're going to talk in detail on the panel on how you do this, but the idea of having 2 testers, 2 individuals who differ in only one observable way, operating in the housing market, helps you identify any systematic differences on how they're treated as being related to the one thing that differs: race, ethnicity, other protected classes. So it's a very compelling mechanism for identifying discrimination. It started really in the 1950s. And at the start, the early tests that used paired testing were called community audits because they were trying to get a sense of, a picture of the practices in a community to illustrate the existence of discrimination. Paired testing moved and expanded in the 1960s as a tool for not only exposing discrimination, but for enforcing the new federal fair housing protections of the Fair Housing Act and related laws. So it moved into the enforcement area, where it expanded and developed much more rigor in the way that it was applied, and created a collection of case law from the enforcement area. The office that I head now, which is the Office of Policy Development and Research, which I'm going to call PD&R for ease, really built on the work that it did in national testing, built on the extensive case law that had already developed in the enforcement area, to do the first national study of the prevalence of discrimination on the basis of race in housing markets in 1977. So it used the methodology that had been developed here and was able to do something slightly different than in the enforcement sphere, which was to say, what do we look like as a nation in terms of the actual experience in housing markets, in terms of discrimination against African Americans, both in the home ownership market, so in mortgages and, in home ownership and rental. It was a breakthrough study at the time, in part because it gave rigorous documentation of significant and blatant discrimination against African Americans. And we did not have that kind of consistent evidence at that level at the time. Of course, we've actually gone on and done other studies since then, and as was noted earlier today, the methodologies and the times have changed since then, and so I want to talk just a little bit about some evolution in thinking about where we are today. The Attorney General spoke about how the methodology of paired testing has changed in their space, so let me just give 3 examples of how it moved over time in HUD's research space, because that's the part that I know best. We started out looking at housing markets at discrimination against African Americans. We've expanded the racial ethnic groups that have been covered in the subsequent national studies to Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans. In 2000, we expanded beyond race and ethnicity to other protected classes. And I want to give one example from this because it's interesting to think about how you evolve methodologies. In 2000, one of the pilots that we did was to test discrimination among people with disabilities. Doing that pilot meant we had to come up with different protocols and methodologies. How does this translate into that sphere? And we learned a lot even before we got to the national study, right? We learned methodologically and also just descriptively a collection of things. And the last evolution for HUD on expanding is expanding beyond protected groups, and that's where we are in our most recent work. We're testing for discrimination against LGBT people and against those with certain sources of income, such as housing choice vouchers and public assistance. I'd say this last piece of expanding beyond protected classes is really a significant change for HUD and an important one. And it kind of goes back to the first fruits of the 1977 study. So these are groups that are not currently protected, at least by federal laws, in the housing markets. But we have much experience on the ground that suggests they experience discrimination in housing markets. And so one role of research in this area can be to document and make the case, and it can be the type of research that affects whether or not policies change and how we might be able to enforce those policies. So hopefully this last evolution on the research side is going to contribute to the collective efforts to eliminate housing discrimination for all. So with that arc of history on where we are as a backdrop, I want to turn to the panelists and introduce them. A second request they had was please don't read my entire bio. So you have the full bios in the pamphlets to look at. I'm going to give just some high points as I introduce them. So immediately to my left is Fred Freiberg, who's the executive director, Freiberg, sorry. But I love that the correction came from the audience. Yes. So obviously, I have an expert sitting next to me that you all know very well, and I have a spelling error in my talking points. Fred has actually spoken here and with many of you. He's the executive director of the Fair Housing Justice Center, a regional civil rights organization that Fred co-founded in 2004. He's a national expert on testing as an investigative tool. He's actually been involved also in some of the earlier HUD studies. Speaking next will be Kenya Robertson, President and CEO of Housing Opportunities Project for Excellence Incorporated, which engages in fair housing enforcement in Miami-Dade and Broward counties in Florida. We're also joined by Shauna Smith, President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance. She founded this alliance here in DC 25 years ago and has done extensive work in education around the Fair Housing Act and precedent-setting investigations. And our final speaker is Marge Turner, Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management at the Urban Institute, an expert on a variety of urban policy and neighborhood issues, somebody who has been involved with many of HUD's national studies, and just as a pure plug to PD&R and HUD, was also the co-editor of an upcoming issue of Cityscape, which is our academic research journal, which is focusing on housing discrimination testing and has a collection of different participants. So those of you who are interested in this topic, it's a freely available journal that will be coming out soon. That's all I know is soon, too. Okay, so we're going to run this as a moderated panel with substantial discussion among the panelists. So the ordering that we're going to do is we're going to start with Fred, who's going to really lay the foundation of understanding how you do this testing and how it can be used. And then we're going to move to Kenya and Shauna, who are going to think about it in enforcement and talk about a collection of issues on how it's used there. Marge will then follow up and talk about how it might be different in research. And then we're just going to move into a bunch of questions so that the experts can be talking to each other about current issues in the area. I am then going to turn it over to Q&A from the audience for the last 15 minutes, so it's good for you to have in mind questions as we go through the moderated part of the panel. And I'll give another reminder before we move to that. And with that, I'm just going to hand this over to Fred.
Great. Good afternoon. I was asked to kick off the discussion with a brief presentation on the use of testing to investigate housing discrimination, which is one of my favorite subjects. Testing has always been and continues to be one of the most effective investigative tools for documenting illegal housing discrimination. As someone who has supervised literally thousands of testing investigations across the country over 4 decades and over the last 10 years in the New York City region, I first want to applaud HUD for including a session on testing at this Fair Housing Policy Conference. Like Betsy Julian, I've attended most of the policy conferences, along with Shauna, I think, over the past 20-some years, and this is by far the best I've ever attended. So congratulations to HUD. Let me begin by offering a quick and easy definition of testing. In the context of enforcing fair housing laws, simply put, testing is an investigative tool used to gather evidence. Now, it's an investigative tool that has 3 characteristics. 1, it requires participation by 1 or more persons. 2, it's covert in nature. And 3, it's done to compare the policies and practices of housing providers against the requirements of fair housing laws. That's a very simple definition of what testing is in the enforcement context. When most people think of testing, however, they think of a paired test, which the Assistant Secretary just mentioned. A paired test is used to assess whether a housing provider is affording 2 comparably qualified individuals who primarily differ on 1 characteristic, such as race, national origin, disability, etc., the same information, service, treatment, and access to housing. In point of fact, a paired test, while commonly used in research studies, as Marge will talk about, is only one type of test structure that is used in investigations conducted to enforce fair housing laws. In preparation for this session, I was asked if I would talk about some of the other varieties of test structures that can be used to investigate contemporary housing discrimination. Ordinarily, I would be delighted to do so when speaking to a group of fair housing law enforcement professionals like yourself. I'd be happy to regale you with stories about how to use different types of test structures to corroborate discrimination. However, once I learned that the session was being video recorded and broadcast to a wider audience, I realized that there was a delicate balance I needed to navigate in my presentation. I have no interest in disclosing specific investigative techniques that might cause violators to further refine or disguise their practices in order to more easily circumvent detection. Affecting a change in housing provider practices is, of course, an objective that all of us have in fair housing law enforcement. But the change sought is compliance with the law, not further subterfuge that makes it possible for the unlawful behavior to continue or makes it difficult for us to detect. I do want to point out, however, that in the enforcement context, a paired test is not always the most effective test structure. If I were to mention a single proxy comparison test, a reference test, a multivariable triad test, or a decoy test, I suspect that those of you who are not test coordinators would be largely unacquainted with those test structures. Yet the test structures I just referenced, and many others I might add, can be quite effective, and they can all be capable of yielding strong, credible evidence of housing discrimination. The type of test structure to be selected for a particular investigation is usually based on information that the test coordinator gathers about the housing provider to be tested. The purpose of all enforcement testing, regardless of the test structure utilized, is to gather credible, objective, and admissible evidence. Now, a few lessons learned. The organization I work for, the Fair Housing Justice Center, has demonstrated through a modest number of testing investigations that housing discrimination remains a persistent, stubborn, and potent force in determining where people may or may not live. With each testing investigation that we conduct, we learn more about the nature or character of housing discrimination and what is happening to ordinary renters and buyers of real estate. I spoke about some of these collective learnings, or what I have termed the ground truths about housing discrimination, in a presentation that I delivered last year in this very auditorium. One thing we know for certain from our investigations, which should not be surprising to any of us, is that most violators of fair housing laws try to elude detection. I'm not going to take my limited time today to recount all of the tactics that violators of fair housing laws employ to elude detection, but I do want to emphasize one point, and that is that those of you in the fair housing enforcement field need to be far more thoughtful, persistent, flexible, and creative in how we conduct testing investigations if we hope to effectively dismantle the remaining barriers to housing choice. What we do know from our experiences to date is that housing discrimination occurs in many different ways, and that a one-size-fits-all approach to testing will not be particularly effective in documenting the varieties of discriminatory housing practices that exist in our local housing markets. Today, enforcement testing practitioners need to consider all possible test structures and decide whether any type of covert investigation might be possible. And I might add, in my office, my investigative coordinators have to tell me why they're not testing a situation, as opposed to the other way around. I start out with the presumption that every situation can be tested until they prove to me that it cannot be tested. So let me share a little bit about our experience in New York. And first, I should tell you something about my office's testing program. We're rather unusual. We call it an Acting for Justice program because we employ 130 professional actors. We're in New York City, so 2 out of 10 people you meet on the streets of Manhattan are underemployed actors. What can I tell you? They've all been trained to participate as testers in investigations. We utilize a considerable amount of technology in our testing program. Because we're in one of the 38 states that permit one-party consensual recording, all of the contacts our testers have with housing providers are recorded, most with digital audio recorders and some with audio-video recorders. While we routinely conduct testing investigations in response to complaints received, we place a much stronger emphasis on designing and implementing systemic testing investigations. This emphasis on systemic testing investigations is predicated on considerable evidence that we have amassed that suggests many renters and buyers of real estate have no way to know when discrimination is occurring, and still other populations are unlikely to complain even when discrimination is suspected. Proactive systemic testing is the only way, in my view, to document some of the more common forms of discrimination, particularly discrimination based on race and national origin. Over the past 5 years, our organization has conducted investigations leading to dozens of lawsuits that have opened up tens of thousands of housing units to populations previously excluded and changed the way that housing providers do business. And to date, these cases have recovered well over $12 million in damages and penalties. We've come to understand the real power of testing is that it has the unique ability to expose and shine a bright light on discriminatory housing practices. As discrimination has become more subtle and violators more sophisticated, the use of testing has become a more important tool for capturing vital observations and information about how housing providers routinely treat people based on protected characteristics. Now, here's 5 additional learnings I'd like to offer for your consideration in my remaining remarks. 1, we know that testing conducted in response to housing discrimination complaints often enables a complainant to meet his or her burden of proof. Victims of housing discrimination deserve to have a testing investigation conducted whenever it is possible to do so. I hope we will soon come to the conclusion, perhaps at the next policy conference, that it is no longer acceptable to have thousands of housing discrimination complaints filed with agencies that have no testing capability, only to have these complaints no-caused or dismissed for lack of evidence. Secondly, we know from testing conducted by private fair housing groups that much of the illegal housing discrimination based on race or national origin is so subtle today that the only way to uncover and eliminate it is to conduct proactive systemic testing investigations. And yet most public enforcement mechanisms, for all practical purposes, are still based on a complaint-responsive model. We need to shift that paradigm to place a much greater emphasis on proactive enforcement with testing as a centerpiece of that new enforcement strategy. Third, we know there are many applications for testing that are underutilized. Testing practitioners need to leave their comfort zone and develop their capability to use testing more extensively in all kinds of investigations. We have effectively used testing to investigate assisted living facilities, nursing homes, senior living communities, banks, local housing authorities, Section 8 rent assistance programs, zoning practices, situations involving tenant harassment, evictions, non-renewals, et cetera, the list goes on. Also, even when testing is structured to find out how a program operates or how a policy is being implemented, a testing investigation can often yield information that has probative value. I have implemented testing investigations where I initially thought I only had evidence of disparate impact, and through the testing was able to uncover evidence of actual intent. That's happened on more than one occasion, and it's often been involving housing authorities, Section 8 programs, and local communities with their zoning practices. Number 4, we know that discrimination does not always surface in the preliminary or initial contacts that testers have with housing providers, and that often when test coordinators assign testers to have additional follow-up with the housing providers, that is when differences in treatment begin to surface. We must recognize that a thorough testing investigation may translate into more time-consuming and costly investigations, and testing organizations need to be able to incur those costs in order to maintain the highest investigative standards. And the 5th point is we know testing can also have an impact on remedies that are obtained in fair housing cases. Stronger evidence can leverage more expansive injunctive relief and even higher damages in some cases. Also consistent with the Supreme Court ruling in Havens Realty v. Coleman, many of our testers bring claims when they are discriminated against and join the FHJC as co-plaintiffs in litigation. Having testers at the table in mediations and settlement discussions has proved very helpful in moving our cases to settlement and to designing appropriate changes to policies and practices. And I want to interject here that I've had a lot of experiences with this in the past few years, and having our testers line up on one side of a table across from the very defendants that discriminated against them is a very powerful thing. And I can tell you it has profoundly changed people's lives, both the defendants as well as some of our testers. It's a very encouraging thing. And the other thing is, just for you lawyers out there who litigate these cases, the testers, because they're the ones who actually went into the office and talked with the rental agent or talked with the loan officer, guess what? They actually have good ideas on injunctive relief and remedies and how the policy should be reshaped. We just got done with a case, and 7 of the suggestions for injunctive relief did not come from me. They came from the testers who were involved in the case. And our testers have been getting fairly large damage awards in cases as well. So that's something all testing organizations should consider. And then I want to close with just one final thought for your consideration. The subtitle of this session is Strong Methods Build Stronger Evidence. While I certainly and wholeheartedly agree with that statement, effective testing also requires highly skilled, dedicated, and well-trained test coordinators, a diverse and well-trained pool of testers, use of appropriate technology, a solid working knowledge of local housing market practices, and I would clearly be remiss to leave out one more very important factor as we sit here among HUD officials and state and local FAP agencies: adequate funding to sustain and strengthen our testing programs. Thank you very much. Next we're going to show a film, and Kenya and I did not conspire to do this, incidentally. We had a film done by a news station in New York on a testing investigation that we had completed, and they ran an I-Team report on an NBC affiliate. And just a few weeks later, or maybe even a week later, NBC affiliate in Miami did the same thing with a case that Kenya's office had filed. And so you're going to see back-to-back these 2 I-Team reports now, we can answer questions about them later, but here's the film.
And now to an I-Team exclusive. For a white person, there's an apartment for rent. But when a black person inquires, sorry, nothing's available. If that sounds like a script from the civil rights era, think again. Tonight, Chris Glorioso investigates a housing discrimination case you might not believe, except that we have the evidence on tape.
Hi, is there a superintendent?
You are listening to audio obtained exclusively by the I-Team.
Any vacancies?
It seems to show blatant racial discrimination. Listen as a white couple is shown an apartment for rent inside this Bronx building.
Maybe a little more space in the kitchen.
Almost as soon as that white couple turns the apartment down, a black renter wanders up to the lobby.
I'm looking for one bedrooms.
But this time, the rental agent tells a very different story.
We have nothing available right now.
It was seconds after the white couple had been offered the apartment that when I asked about the availability of one-bedroom apartments in the building, he said, oh, there are no one-bedrooms.
We have nothing available right now.
Is there any other explanation for what happened to you than housing discrimination?
No.
John is the black man who was denied. We can't share his identity because both he and the white couple who went to the building before him are part of a secret team of testers from the Fair Housing Justice Center. Each year, they look to catch landlords in the act, lying and denying apartment vacancies whenever minorities inquire.
You don't always know when you're being discriminated against.
Today, housing discrimination is more like a revolving door where people are politely and courteously escorted in, out of, and ultimately away from the desired housing.
Fred Freiberg is executive director of Fair Housing Justice. He uses census data to spot the buildings that seem to have too few minorities. Now he's bringing suit against the owners of 4300 Martha Avenue, the building from which John was turned away.
It seems to me quite clear that race is infecting the practices of this rental housing provider.
The I-Team tried to contact the building landlord, a man named Patrick O'Connell, to ask if he purposely tries to keep black residents out. So far, we haven't heard back. We did speak with one of his longtime tenants who says she's never seen discrimination here.
How could he discriminate when they're living here? It's a lot of nonsense.
40-year tenant Margaret Farrell told us she knows of a black family living in her building. But the fair housing testers say there is no doubt about what happened to them.
It's egregious.
Bianca is another black tester who was told a different story than the white ones.
He made it clear that the apartment was available.
Just seconds after a white couple was shown an apartment in another O'Connell building, Bianca inquired.
Are you showing apartments for this building?
Listen as the rental agent tells Bianca the apartment was taken by her fellow testers.
Is it possible for me to see it?
It's rented.
I believe it just shows that no matter where you are, there's always going to be some kind of discrimination.
Those fair housing testers say they file about a dozen lawsuits a year demanding landlords treat minorities equally. If you're looking for a home and you suspect discrimination, you can file a housing discrimination complaint with the federal government. For more information on that, you can go to NBCNewYork.com. Reporting from the newsroom, Chris Glorioso, News 4, New York.
Potential tenants are turned away from a South Florida apartment complex.
Yeah, Jackie, and one group says it's all because of their skin color. Now the owners are being slapped with a lawsuit.
Team 6 reporter Ari Adzer is live in Miami to explain the accusations. Ari?
Jackie, you might call this a housing sting operation. A local nonprofit group sent people into this complex here behind me to try to rent apartments. They were men, they were women, they were black, they were white, they were all well dressed. They tried to make them as closely matched as possible. And this group says the results of their experiment were blatantly discriminatory. It's called Design Place, a sprawling, pleasant-looking complex that appears welcoming unless, according to this lawsuit, you are African American.
I was told in no uncertain terms that they didn't have anything available and to come back later.
They did tell me that they did have apartments available for me.
Quite a contrast from your colleagues.
Yes, that is what I understand. That's I think it's disgusting.
Aaron Lewis and Dante Cooper are housing discrimination testers, so we're not showing their faces. They went separately to Design Place on the same day in October. They work for Hope Incorporated, a nonprofit that fights housing discrimination. The black testers and the white testers had completely different experiences. Is that what you're telling us?
Yes, they had different experiences. They were given different information about the availability of units and price, and that's definitely a violation of the fair housing law to do so on the basis of race.
According to the lawsuit filed by Hope, 6 testers went looking for apartments, and the pattern was striking. African Americans were consistently told apartments just weren't available.
I'm ticked off that something actually like this can occur.
I felt like people really needed to know about this, first of all, and that they really needed to be held accountable. I felt very angry when I found out that this is the way people have been treated.
The complex is run by SPV Realty. We have made repeated calls for comment about the lawsuit, but have gotten no response. Meanwhile, the CEO of Hope says housing discrimination is just more subtle these days.
Sometimes it's discrimination with a smile. They get all of the information about the housing, but the housing's not made available to them, nor do they know that they're not being told the truth with regard to what is in fact available.
So apparently housing discrimination is not a relic of days gone by. Now we want to reiterate that we made repeated calls to SPV Realty today trying to get somebody to comment about the lawsuit, and our calls were simply not returned. We are live in Little Haiti tonight. Ari Odzer, NBC 6, South Florida.
It's a little difficult. Forgot to push the button. A little difficult for me not to get a little upset every time I see that, in that particular instance, we discovered their discriminatory practices by sending out our testers on practice tests. And so that's how those two people ended up going the same day. They were the first round of testers that went there that day. There were 3. And the differences were so striking that we then did follow-up testing at that particular property. I'm probably also a little on edge today because before I came to this panel, I was on the telephone with a young woman who just visited a property, and we believe she is a bona fide victim of a property that we just tested, and we were actually preparing to file. However, we've now identified another real victim. And what was so striking about my conversation with this woman was the fact that she had no idea what happened. Somebody actually got me to her. She had no idea. Neither did the couple I spoke to last week who visited that property. They had no clue. Because of exactly what I described there. You go in, they tell you everything about it, they'll show you models, there are all kinds of things that happen, but then when you lay down the differences, you see the real power in testing in terms of what's made available to you, when it's made available to you, how much does it cost, and what's done to either encourage you to rent there or not to. So the power in this testing is just, it's unspeakable sometimes, but it's so much so that I get to brag too, Fred. Now we've been, at Hope, we've been doing this for 25 years, and how did you catch us this quickly? At any rate, millions of dollars later, we've never gone to trial with our testing evidence. Never gone to trial, it's that strong. So oftentimes they have no idea who was there, what happened, but I'm like, well, here's your agent. She wrote her name on a piece of paper, and she wrote down 2 different things on the same day for 2 different people. You know, there you go. The difference between the work that we do in Miami that Fred gets to do in New York is we don't get to record. We don't get to audio record. Fred said he's going to come on down to Miami if the law ever changes, so that then I can retire before him. But I'm not going anywhere if we get to record, because that would just be too sexy. It just would. So here's the thing. It's absolutely important that you do quality control like any other business. And it begins in-house with your staff. You know, making sure that your test coordinators do not have too many tests to do in too short of time, so that they're not on top of every issue that they need to be on top of. Making sure that there is quality over quantity so that you can get the results, because those are the numbers that matter. Those thousands of housing units that open up for people, those victims that get identified and receive redress for what's happened to them. That's the power in the work that we do. But it's also those testers and holding them, you know, when they're there to give you everything that you need and pull from them. You know, they're going to give you what they've got because you got dedicated folks out there doing the work, but making sure that you're not afraid to say, when Fred said, it's not just send out, go one time. Do like I tell my children, check your work. you know, you can proofread something, but if I wrote it, you know, oftentimes I will say what I meant for it to say, but that's not what it really says. But if somebody else reads it for you, so having that check inside is also very, very helpful. Choosing where you go. Now, that was just luck. We were doing, you know, some training. But Black History Month came, and one of our test coordinators saw a program, was watching something, and was like, oh, look at, where did slavery happen in Miami? Where's the trade? I could go do some testing. Let me find a place I want to test over there. Same results, and I think that's actually the video, the right video. I think I uploaded the wrong one, but NBC has been good to us in terms of letting our community know what's going on. It was, I was waiting for you to poke me under the table and say, that's the wrong video. But there was another case covered by NBC for us, but that is how our TC took a look, and he said, well, I'm gonna go over there where this activity was taking place in Miami and just see what bears fruit, take a look at census data. We also recently filed against a property where, if anybody's familiar with Miami's city of Opa-locka, and I'd call it Chocolate City. So, you know, you go to a city and there's the majority of the folks there are Black, but then there are no Black folks in this big old apartment complex. And it was funny because I mentioned that to a politician, and they just died laughing. They're like, no Blacks in apartments. And I said, yeah. I personally sat outside for about 60, 90 minutes and watched, and the only Black folks that I saw were people who you were very clear didn't live there. The postal worker was delivering something, another delivery man was delivering something. There was folks with some religious literature visiting people, and they got in their car and they left. And we said, hey, you guys live here? No, we're just doing our ministry. Okay, well, thank you for sharing, you know, what's going on here. But we kept going, and just remember that that's the most important thing that you can do, is to make certain that you're not sending anybody out to do the work who's not been trained by somebody who knows and has done this. The power in the experience is just, it's great. There's so much that's not even in books when people can share with you the benefit of what they've learned out there in the market, particularly in yours specifically. So having your ear in your community and knowing what's going on is critical. The other thing that I'd say about our particular work at Hope, so that do some of the FAPs, do you feel left out just a little bit? Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk to you about City of Tampa. City of Tampa has worked with us a number of times over the years, and most recently they received one of those FIP-FAP grants. So if you have a qualified fair housing organization near you, you talk to them about working on a particular effort like this. We actually work with the City of Tampa on a testing program and their FAP, and the result of our testing work with them is used for them to initiate their own enforcement actions. And where they don't find evidence that they feel they can file an enforcement action, they solicit attendees for education. We took a look at what's going on in your shop. We found evidence of differential treatment of folks who came. We think you need some compliance training. And then for those who receive dollars from the federal government, our qualified fair housing organizations here utilize testing to assist them in making sure that things are built in compliance with design and construction requirements, make sure that those waiting lists are being properly maintained by doing testing, looking at where we can test, I think then gives the testimony for really how powerful this is. So not only do we need to make the case, strengthen the methodologies for stronger testing, but we have to strengthen the case for testing itself so that it is utilized everywhere that it can be utilized. There is a new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, and one of the components is find violations, find evidence of discrimination happening in your jurisdiction. Test, do some testing. get that testing done. But as you're also putting together tests with your FHEO grants, take a look at where, when you're taking a look at where you can test, you can get evidence that can be used by jurisdictions to put in their assessments of fair housing so that everybody has, first of all, knowledge of it because it's supposed to be made available to the public for them to see it, but what's going on in the jurisdiction so that you know what you need to address. You make a stronger case for our work and for what we do. With that, I'm gonna pass the ball to Shauna. They stuck me in the middle of these two because if they spoke first, I would have nothing else to say. So with that, I pass the mic to Shauna.
So good afternoon. Sherilyn Eifel yesterday said, "What are the contemporary manifestations of discrimination?" The National Fair Housing Alliance only does systemic investigations. But when you think about the contemporary manifestations of discrimination, I think of what people have called scientific racism. So let's start with the algorithms that are being used. How many of you have heard of yield star? 3. We learned about this when we were doing systemic investigations with members of the National Fair Housing Alliance for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And we found differences in availability and price of units. But during the conciliations, one of the things we learned was that these large, medium-sized to large apartment complexes are using systems like YieldStar. There are 3 other names that escape me right now. And what these systems do is they gather all the vacancies and the rental prices of vacancies in that community. And I, as the landlord, the owner of the property, buy this system so I can every hour know what the demand is in the community and how much rent I can charge, and it can be changed hourly. Lots of them pay for it to be changed daily. How many of you knew that? It was a surprise to us while we're in negotiations. So one of the things we have to do in our testing is to find out if they have these systems and if they're changed hourly or daily. And if they're changed hourly, we need to figure out to make sure the testers get in as close in time as Fred's test, well, maybe not seconds, depends on what city you're in, but get in close in time within that same hour. But the other thing, the way to challenge that is the managers figure it out. They know during the month when rents are high, when rents go low, when rents go high again, and when they go low. And what we were able to use in our negotiations was the fact that these managers gave the hearing testers advice. If you can wait 2 more weeks, that rent may come down $150. So even though they've created what I consider scientific racism, and they thought they'd be immune by saying it's a neutral system that we use. People come in, they rent apartments, that's how much it costs that hour. That's how much it costs that day. We found out the managers use that information to benefit hearing people. The other kinds of scientific racism is in the credit scoring models that you heard talked about in the last session and yesterday, and the algorithms that are used there. And people who know me know that I have said it is discrimination in those systems, discrimination comes out, because credit has never been available on an equal basis to people of color and women in this country, ever. And it's still not happening. Otherwise, CFPB wouldn't be suing, and the Justice Department, the auto loan companies for charging people of color and women higher prices to buy a car. You pay more when you get a mortgage loan. You pay more when you get a credit card. So when you pay more for credit, your take-home pay is reduced simply because of your gender or your race or national origin. So when they create these credit scoring systems and these algorithms that they tell us are race neutral, that's just a lie. Because unless they're balancing the factors in their math to compensate for the discrimination that happens when you get access to credit, then it's not fair. But everybody's using them. Rental complexes are now using credit scores. Real estate sales agents will run your credit score before they show you homes. We know the lenders have been using it forever, and homeowners insurance companies for renters insurance and homeowners insurance have insurance scores now. The lending discrimination, the advantage of being old and doing this for 40 years and still having a very good memory, is that everything we're seeing now in lending discrimination is everything we saw in the 70s and the 80s. So there are minimum loan amounts back. There were minimum loan amounts when I started this in 1975. We see that they have the MI, mortgage insurance companies. We sued for minimum insurance amounts back in 1988, and the MI companies are doing it again. If you're going to do lending investigations, you need to understand what a qualified mortgage means. You heard Lisa Rice say QM. If you don't understand what the Dodd-Frank law said and what we're looking at, you may come forward and try to bring a case of lending discrimination when really it may have been the ability to repay issue came up. So don't just get out there and do lending testing without understanding what the requirements are today of getting a loan. I still have a problem with any minimum loan amounts. There are ways, they don't want to have these high-cost loans if they do lower-priced loans. Like Jim McCarthy was saying, they have $50,000 minimums. That has a disparate and discriminatory impact in communities of color and in integrated communities. There's one bank that my staff recently told me just doesn't have minimum loan amounts. If this big bank can do business without minimum loan amounts, everybody else can. And then you have the overlays. All of these banks are writing overlays to the underwriting guidelines of Freddie, Fannie, and FHA. So if FHA accepts a 620 or 600 or 580 FICO score, the banks are saying, no, we will only accept 720, 750, 780. And then they say, well, that's because they'll force us to buy back the loan if it goes bad. So just see these as excuses and not actual business justifications. On the design and construction side, you would think, we didn't even start investigating design and construction until about 10 years ago because I kept saying, oh, DOJ is doing it. People won't build properties inaccessible. That's just silly. Naive me, right? Because we were doing all our race cases and our national origin cases and our insurance cases. And when we started looking at the design and construction, we were shocked. But Ann Hotelling and I were talking when she was working with us about who financed that builder and that construction. Why don't we sue the banks who gave the loans? Because banks are supposed to do due diligence when they make loans. So Ann and I met with, Donna Murphy will remember, we met with DOJ, all the federal regulators, and said, we're going to start suing your banks. Because you go in and do due diligence with them, they're supposed to do due diligence. If I take out a home improvement loan, they're supposed to make sure I did a home improvement. If I'm building housing, why don't they make sure they follow the design and construction requirements? So the collaboration that we engage in as the National Fair Housing Alliance and the testing is what tells us about these kinds of discrimination. So we get our information two ways. We do a lot of education for the industry, and they come and whisper in my ear and say, Shauna, did you know about this? Oh, no. Okay, thank you. I'll start investigating it. And then testing develops for us the kinds of additional issues we should investigate. And testing is also an investigation. And it's not just testing with people. With our REO investigations that have been going on now in 60 cities across the United States, we're comparing houses in African American and Latino working and middle-class neighborhoods, to foreclosed homes that the bank owns in white neighborhoods. And what we consistently see in all 60 communities we've been in is that Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, U.S. Bank, Fannie Mae's field service vendors fail to take care of the properties in communities of color the same way they do in white communities. And Wells Fargo settled with us. It was $30 million, and for the FAP agencies, so you know, that didn't go into our pockets. $3 million was divided with the lawyers and 14 fair housing centers, and $27 million is going back into communities in the form of grants, not just for down payment assistance and rehab loans, but in Miami, they've built community gardens. In Indianapolis, bike trails. In Grand Rapids, they're working in a zip code and have a transit line that's going right through the community and doing the revitalization in the neighborhoods, making these African American Latino neighborhoods desirable communities so they're communities of choice. So my time's up. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around for an end of the day panel. Kathy mentioned at the beginning that testing for enforcement and testing for research have common roots and have been intertwined over the decades, but they're also different in really important ways. And so I thought I'd focus on the differences because I think they're relevant to you and to your work. So the Urban Institute has been a partner with HUD and with the fair housing organizations on many national pair testing studies, 1989, 2000, 2012, and on these new extensions of the pair testing methodology that Kathy described at the beginning. So we're really proud to have been the research partner in this effort over the years. I wanted to highlight three big differences between research paired testing and enforcement paired testing. First, as researchers, because we want to be able to generalize our findings to the market as a whole, we draw representative samples of housing providers or available housing units. We don't target to where there are reasons to suspect that bad behavior is occurring. Because we need to roll up the results over hundreds or thousands of tests to produce estimates of the share in which some kind of discriminatory treatment occurred, we need to use strictly consistent protocols over those hundreds of tests. So that means we don't have the flexibility that Fred talked about and that enforcement testing must use to sort of go where the discrimination seems to be happening. And finally, again, because we have to roll up over hundreds or thousands of tests, we use closed-ended reporting forms. Check the box. Choose from one of these options. Only in a limited number of our tests do we actually use the kinds of detailed narratives, let alone recording, that gives you the nuance and the detail that's compelling evidence in an enforcement action. So very often, the local fair housing agencies that do enforcement testing, including Fred and Kenya, work with us as partners to conduct tests for research. And I know that they find this partnership extremely frustrating because our protocols are very different. and because we're sticklers about adhering to them. So just as the strong fair housing groups are sticklers about quality control on their enforcement testing, we're sticklers about these kind of these very different protocols that we have to insist upon. So I think that the protocols that we have been using for research and that we've worked on together for research represent today's gold standard for research testing, but they most definitely should not be considered the gold standard for enforcement testing. Data from a research test really would not provide the best evidence or even compelling evidence in an individual enforcement action. And they don't allow for the kind of flexibility and innovativeness that Fred argued we need moving forward in this space. Instead, what they let us do, which I think is important, is to produce measures of the incidence and basic forms of discrimination that's occurring across the marketplace as a whole. And those kinds of estimates can be very compelling when presented hand in hand with individual cases with real people standing up and talking about what happened to them. I also would say that the evidence, the research evidence from our latest round of national paired tests on discrimination against African Americans, Latinos, and Asians in both rental and sales confirms that discrimination today is extremely subtle. I don't see how a victim of discrimination would know that he or she had experienced it, which means indeed that an enforcement system that relies on complaints as the main mechanism is really going to miss too much of the discrimination that's occurring. I also feel our latest research studies suggest that more discrimination may be happening later in the process than we have traditionally tested in research testing. So I think that that's a challenge for research testing going forward, is how do we continue to push farther into the process? When we get farther into discussion and question and answer, I think there are a lot of ways in which research testing and enforcement testing have been complementary over the decades, but could develop new ways to be partners and complementary going forward. With enforcement testing organizations suggesting types of neighborhoods, types of properties or providers, circumstances, phases of the process where we should pilot some new research testing methodologies and push into those corners of the market and see what we can learn about the overall incidence of those kinds of discrimination that they are still tragically capturing in individual enforcement tests. So, thanks.
Thank you, Marge, and thank you all for this. So we're going to move into some Q&A up here within the panelists, and as we're doing that, the conversation that you've already heard may have prompted some questions that you want to be teeing up in your head for the open Q&A with the audience. So Marge, I actually want to, partially, this is again very self-serving. Where you ended is an incredibly useful place for thinking about how the two ways in which testing occurs could be useful. And we're at more of a crossroads now than we were in 1977. The panelists have mentioned several changes that add challenges for all types of testing for discrimination, the subtlety, and it being later in the process. And there have been a few suggestions on ways we might be able to move forward, but maybe it would be good to have a little more of that discussion, including with whether there are things that you're learning in how you've moved in your enforcement testing that could inform some research practices in the future.
Do you want to start?
Well, I think the email testing by names, I think linguistic profiling is really important. I know we had a conflict with Urban Institute back in the time when they were doing insurance testing, and they had an expert who said, well, only white people should make the calls to the insurance agent because they had neutral voices. And I went, there's no such thing as a neutral voice. So our brains process the voice we hear. And there's been research to show that our brains, say, can guess the person's race, national origin, age within 5 years, even educational level, just by listening to someone count to 20. So linguistic profiling, I think, is really important to implement, because if you hang up on me or if you give me false information over the phone, but you give someone who sounds like me over the phone truthful information. And the email testing research that's been done wasn't controlled enough. But I think they could start using that, because that screening process starts immediately. They don't have to see you, they just have to guess who you are to turn you down.
So I think those are great examples. There's been some really terrific and very economical testing done in the employment space, relying on how names are understood and interpreted, that show high levels of discrimination in the hiring phase, where resumes are either rejected or moved forward based on whether the name is implies an African American or a white person. I also think on the speech and phone point, this is a really good example. In our 2000 study, we did not incorporate what happened to the testers when they tried by phone to make their appointments. We didn't treat that as part of the test we were measuring because we weren't sure they were racially identifiable. And Shauna and others criticized us roundly for that. And we and HUD listened to that criticism, and the 2012 study did include the phone phase in the analysis and developed some methods for assessing the identifiability, the racial or ethnic identifiability of the testers on the phone. And we did indeed find that the more racially identifiable a person was, the more likely they were to be treated differently right at that early phone stage. So I think we have a history of challenging each other on these methods and moving the field forward. And I think on this issue of pushing farther into the transaction past the initial encounter that has been the venue of research testing, I'm really interested in the ways we could think about how to push that into the research phase as well, into the research testing.
You looked like you were about to say something.
I was about to say
Yeah.
something. I'm not anti-research, and Marge knows this. I've worked with her extensively in the past on research projects. I think she pointed out all the problems with some of the national studies that have been done in the areas in which there are significant differences between those of us in enforcement and the way in which the research testing is done. The sampling issue is a huge issue, and there's hardly a defendant we've sued in New York that would have ever shown up in an HDS study. And that's pretty alarming, because the defendants we've sued control, tens of thousands of units of housing. So it's not like they missed a few mom and pop landlords in the testing study. They missed major housing providers that simply choose not to advertise, so they weren't sampled. So I think for policymakers to rely on a study that is, in my view, so fundamentally flawed on the issue of whether the sample is representative of the housing market is a serious one. It's one that raises concerns because people rely on that information. We heard it in several speeches that were made during this conference. So it raises concern, and we see much more discrimination in the marketplace, not just because we target areas where we think discrimination exists, but because we go to places that aren't advertised in traditional places that are sampled. So that's a fundamental thing. I do agree with Marge that there are areas where the envelope could be pushed a little further, and areas that have not been explored that much by enforcement agencies, where the Urban Institute could do some testing that would be beneficial, exploratory testing. The lending study that I was involved in with Marge in the homeownership testing project, I think it was called, really taught me a great deal about lender testing. It's where I learned most of what I know about lender testing, and this past year we brought the first federal lawsuit against a major lender in the 47 years of the Fair Housing Act based only on testing evidence. And it was based on that research project. So that was an example of research that was definitely useful to those of us in enforcement. It helped a lot. I think the other thing is the area of non-testing research that we need to look at that's more supply side and looking at housing provider practices. You know, so often we study the populations that are discriminated against and the consumer activity. Maybe we need to study the housing providers a little bit, and that would be even more useful to those of us in enforcement. So studying how housing providers market and advertise their properties, how many, you know, there's a lot of types of research that I could see as being extremely beneficial to those of us in enforcement that would help us identify where the violators are located. And so I would suggest that's another area, studying tax credit properties, studying, you know, there's just a number of issues that are on the front burners for enforcement organizations around the country, but we often lack the research capabilities that I think the Urban Institute would be particularly good at. And so those are some suggestions.
And we already have people lining up. I love it. So I'm going to ask one more thing to the panel, but since we have questions, I'm going to go quickly to them. So this is another blatant plug. I love that you have ideas on things that we can do that are also non-testing research, because what was most important to do in 1977 and maybe with expansions in the last couple of decades may not be HUD's value add in the next series. And we are just starting now the next stage, the second round of the research roadmap, which is the time when we engage with stakeholders on what are the most important questions for us to ask from HUD. And so thinking about getting a queue up of what those are, it's a really good mechanism for that. And we'll be using technology for getting input from stakeholders, not just the listening sessions around the nation. So I was going to ask one question to the panel on whether there are other changes in the housing markets that we should be thinking about that have affected our ability to use testing. You've named 3: the subtlety of discrimination, that where it is in that discrimination occurs later in the process, something that can be harder to get at, and a third was the surprising algorithms. Are there any others that we should tee up as thinking about the current context? And then I will open up queue.
You go first.
I think I would just generally say that, and this is my pitch to most test coordinators that I train, and that is that the industry is using all kinds of technology to aid them with discrimination. And Shauna's just mentioned one more sophisticated form, but whether it's a camera outside the front door that prevents the owner or the manager from answering the door when they see a person of color inquiring about apartments, or whether there's some screening done by telephone, or I mean, the case you saw in the video involved a housing provider that had owned in their family those housing units for 85 years, had never rented to an African American. They had never advertised a unit. Their manager was in a locked 2-story unmarked building, and the manager was screening calls. You will not believe what we had to go through to get those tests done that you saw the videotape of. And so I think there's a lot of technology used by housing providers, and we have to then employ technology ourselves to combat that kind of discrimination. And I have all kinds of suggestions of technology that I share with test coordinators all the time. We even have some that we host on our website that are on a secure page that's available to test coordinators. And I certainly encourage groups to use technology as often as possible to aid with their test coordination as well as with identifying violators.
Well, when you get outside of the East Coast and West Coast that has high density apartments, you have the rest of America where there are a lot of single family homes that are rented. And what you have to do in those situations, because these people have been advised to say, oh, you know, 2 people came before you. If that falls through, we'll give you a call because you seem like you'd be a great tenant for me. And what you have to do in HDS, and what we do regularly, is have repeat visits by the same tester going back to find out if it's still available. So those 2 people before the African American tester, at least one of them was a white tester. And they can always go back and ask, or they can follow up with the African American tester and ask. But calling one time, you're going to get people being really nice. Oh yeah, you know, there's some other people in front of you, and they'll say that to everybody. They'll say that to whites and blacks as well. There's some other people in front of you. Why don't you fill out the application? I'll get back to you. That way they can screen and they can control. But if you just make one phone call, the same in all of our real estate sales testing we do, we spend the weekend. We're out there with the real estate agents. Our testers have rental cars. They have burner phones. We have cell phones that we can change the area codes for. We stay at hotels. They pick the testers up at the hotels because that's what real people do when they're moving into a new community to buy a house. They stay at a hotel. They meet a real estate agent. They meet the real estate agent Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, unless you're Kenya, when she was a tester for us, and they wouldn't show her a single house, but they would show her homes on her computer at the hotel room and drive her past houses and say, well, maybe tomorrow I can get an appointment set up for you for that. A real person in a new community. So it costs more money to do good research-based testing as well as doing enforcement-based testing.
I just want to piggyback on something that Fred brought up, and it's capturing the housing providers that we're not going to find in the sampling. And when you look at areas that are in high demand, like Miami Beach, this is all they're doing for rent. And in areas where it's a half-decent neighborhood and folks can pay a nice rent, those are going to be, they don't even have to put up the cheap Craigslist ad. All they have to do is put something in the window that says that it's available for rent. And we're talking about even large buildings. There's just something outside. So in that, not only for sampling for research, but also in identifying targets, because if you're limiting what you're doing to just what's published in paper or in the for rent magazines, you're going to be missing folks who own a whole lot of stuff that's not in the magazine. They just know where to own it, and they know how to get folks, get them into their rental units without having to spend a dime on advertising.
I'm really interested in thinking about what could we learn about the behavior of housing providers in different kinds of markets around the country that would let us get better samples.
Right. And also keeping in mind, and this is just for me because of where I am, taking into consideration the actual market. Having a non-Hispanic white person on the phone calling everybody, that's so not Miami. It just isn't. So we kind of have to be able to see where some protocols can allow for certain things that would make it a realistic situation in our market. And thank you for wanting to open up that dialogue.
Great. I think I've now that I've primed us for having questions and we have a queue, I'm going to move to the audience. So as you come to the mic, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, and I know we may have some questions coming in from online. If your question is for somebody specific on the panel, feel free to name them, but they'll jump in as they're interested in.
I actually don't have a question, I have a comment. I think that there's been a couple sessions that I've come through that have been coordinated by HUD around testing, and every time I come, there's never a FAP agency on the panel, and I think that's a missed opportunity, specifically for FAP agencies who do use testing. I'm a huge supporter of testing. I'm from the city of Dayton. We work very closely with Miami Valley Fair Housing. We contract with them on an annual basis to do testing, and it has been very helpful to us. And for those FAP organizations who are not doing testing, it has increased our caseload. We have used it for exploratory testing. Shauna talked a little bit about the DEF testing. In our FAP partnership grant a few years ago, we actually added DEF testing in there as an exploratory testing opportunity so that we could see whether or not DEF testing or discrimination against people who are hard of hearing was actually an issue. And then we've also used it in terms of looking at situations for people who are convicted felons who are having a hard time finding housing. So I think that anytime we have this discussion about testing, since I've been in this role, I always hear that FIPS and FAPS are not working well together. I think there are some examples where FIPS and FAPS are working together, and it's a huge opportunity to talk about the successes of that and how we can be proactive about engaging our FIPS and FAPS and working together.
Thank you.
I just want to comment on that and just say thank you for that comment. And maybe, yeah, I think it's on. Maybe what an idea for a research project would be for the Urban Institute to study enforcement agencies around the country and see what differences appear between those that use testing and those that don't, and whether the outcomes are different.
I can tell you the answer to that.
Hello, my name's Ted Wimpy. I'm with Fair Housing Project in Vermont, and currently we're doing education outreach, particularly around systemic issues of discrimination and affirmatively furthering fair housing. In the past, we have had some grants. It's been quite a few years ago doing testing. Now, the agency that is doing testing in Vermont is Vermont Legal Aid. Our FHEO, the Human Rights Commission in Vermont, is not permitted to do testing under their rules currently. But I'm very interested in testing. But one of the things in particular that piqued my interest, unless I was just hallucinating this, I thought somebody said something about relating testing to zoning. And I'm very curious about that and how that might work.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm the guilty one. We have used testing extensively. We've even, I think Michelle San Antonio's in the room too. Her organization and ours cooperated on an investigation involving a community that had a zoning category for affordable housing, and they built in a residency preference. And when affordable housing became available, we tested it and showed how the residency preference ended up, it resulted in all of the affordable housing units being occupied by white people, even though we sent people of color and other people to the place to apply. So testing was useful in showing how discriminatory residency preferences and other discriminatory provisions that are in zoning ordinances, and I have to add a footnote here. I don't want to keep throwing work at Marge, but you know, the issue of residency preferences around the country, which I think was alluded to in an earlier panel, is a huge problem. And that information is publicly available. We just finished collecting it for the entire 12-county New York region that we serve. And I've got 42 potential lawsuits percolating right now because it's so pervasive. And I would think someone ought to do a study nationally of residency preferences that exist. If HUD hasn't already done one, it would be very useful to know where those residency preferences are being used, what the racial makeup of those communities are, et cetera, because those are all areas that will interest us, whether we're interested in enforcement, AFFH, bringing disparate impact cases, whatever the case may be. So that's another suggestion I have.
Hi, I'm Jim McCarthy from the Miami Valley Fair Housing Center in Dayton, Ohio. So I want to start out with a compliment and say I was glad to see research that had been done in the past connected in the NOFA with follow-up for enforcement now. I think that HUD needs to do more of that based upon the research that's done, and then encouraging or providing direction about what you're interested in funding to back up and do enforcement support. But when we do that, we have to make sure that we find ways to create more money to do that type of testing. We've been talking a lot about systemic discrimination testing, and it costs a lot of money to do that. And I had the good fortune, but also an interesting experience of being able to participate in the 1990 HDS, and then in the 2000 HDS, and then a follow-up HDS. And one of the things that we ran into is that when we were doing the follow-up HDS for families with children and disability, the Urban Institute paid much better for research methodology than we were able to pay our testers for enforcement methodology. And that really bled our testers out, and we actually ran into a problem where follow-up testing, where we had good testers and the Urban Institute wanted to use them in other cities, and we lost testers from our enforcement pool because they were traveling to do research methodology, quite frankly, because the people with disabilities were making more money, and they wanted the more money there. So we need to find some way to bring a parity to what we pay people for research methodology to what we pay people for enforcement methodology. And then the final thing I want to know is there anything more that we can do as a movement to better, and I mean this in a partnership, to make people understand that testing is a legitimate means for investigating housing discrimination. And I'm going to give you a very selfish example. I spent probably 2 months of time and a lot of money this spring fighting back the Ohio legislature who framed testing as entrapment and illegal and unnecessary to the point that they are looking at changing our law from being substantially equivalent. And I think we need to do a better job of educating our local and state legislators that testing is a legitimate way to investigate and a necessary way to investigate, particularly systemic testing, not just complaint testing. And I'd like to know if any of you guys have thoughts about that.
Well, I think that education really should be coming from HUD and the Department of Justice, because when we say it's legitimate, they go, yeah, yeah, yeah. But when the government says this is a valuable tool, the courts have upheld it, you know, if cities take actions to limit or eliminate testing, the Justice Department and HUD weighed in when Virginia was going to do that. So the strength comes from the federal government saying these are legitimate practices. And they should be stepping in Ohio now because of what the state legislature's talking about doing. And saying, well, you know, we'll defund your Ohio Civil Rights Commission. They don't care. There are so many FAP agencies during the crisis that had to move their offices from where they were. Some told me they were in the dog pound place, and the staffs were dramatically cut. And too many state legislatures don't care if their civil rights offices, state civil rights or local civil rights offices are closed. So HUD and Justice need to say, oh, you're going to lose Department of Transportation money. You're going to lose EPA money. You're going to lose education money. Because that's what the law says. The Fair Housing Act covers every single federal dollar that's spent, not just housing. And so if HUD works with DOT, with EPA, and with the Department of Defense, you know, we can stop these challenges against our practices that are legal and legitimate.
My name is Alyssa Wetzel-Moore, and I'm with the St. Paul Department of Human Rights and Equal Economic Opportunity in Minnesota. And I'm a FAP that's more than convinced that I would love to have a testing program that's part and parcel of what we do. We have a really great legal aid agency in the city of St. Paul, also one in Minneapolis. And so it's more, what are the step-by-step processes that you would recommend for us to really implement a meaningful testing program?
Well, the National Fair Housing Alliance, we've created, 12, 13, 14 private fair housing centers, and our newest one is in Denver. It starts out with you allocating community development block grant funds to the local fair housing center. And if you call us, we have the whole step-by-step. And HUD funds through the FIP program the establishment of new fair housing centers where there are none. And a fair housing center would work hand in hand with Jay, because they would be a full-service group that does the things that Kenya and Fred and I used to do when I was in Toledo.
So I just get the money, and then everything falls into place?
You get the money, yeah. Yeah, it's true.
Okay.
It's as simple as that.
Okay.
You need to start out with probably 250, 300,000.
Okay.
350,000 at a minimum, because you're looking at Minneapolis. And we've been doing the REO investigations in Minneapolis, and I can tell you, you've got a big problem with US Bank. But you put that seed money there to get them started, then they'll be eligible to apply for the FIP money with HUD, and then they're entitled to damages as an organization when they bring these cases.
Okay. Thank you.
And you now know each other, so there's another half a day of the conference, so
I'll
this
get you my
conversation
card.
can continue. I believe we have a question online.
We have a call from Alicia Magazoo from the Community Legal Services of Mid-Florida. Please address statute of limitations as it relates to design and construction testing. When does the time begin to toll? Does a property have to be tested within a certain amount of time from issuance of the last certificate of occupancy?
Ann, you want to answer that? No, she's really, Ann's quite an expert on design and construction.
Well, according to the HUD guidance, HUD-DOJ joint guidance, that as long as there is a as long as the violation exists, the statute of limitation continues. There's been some case law. You could have a pattern in practice if they continue to build in violation. And also, the Department of Justice has no statute of limitations for injunctive relief so that they can get retrofits made, and they have like a 5-year statute of limitations for monetary damages. So it depends.
Right.
But that's a very specific, it depends.
Right.
That's great.
But then
The other it depends is the circuits are divided on the
Correct.
when the statute of limitations runs on design and construction. So it really does depend on where you are and what the circuit says.
And in Florida, you need to also look at the state statute, and then a resource to direct you to, hi Alicia, I know who that is, to Matt Dietz down in Miami with regard to that issue in Florida. He's done a lot of design and construct work in Florida and Georgia as well, so call me.
But just remember, DOJ has no statute of limitations. So if you're boxed out, DOJ will step in.
Great. I think you absolutely get to ask the question. You were half of the answer to the previous question. So, and I believe we're supposed to be ending in 3 minutes. Okay.
So I just want
This may be the last question.
I'm Ann Hotellingham with Hope Fair Housing Center, formerly with NAFA with Shauna. And I just wanted to make a pitch for the whole idea of testing with FAPs, testing with private fair housing organizations, and even HUD. If you don't have the dollars and you get a case that comes in that you think sounds like discrimination, call your local fair housing organization if you have a relationship with them. If you refer the caller, the intake to them, the fair housing organization can test it and provide additional evidence. And so am I right that anybody up here, if you got a referral from HUD or the FAP agency, you would test it? So
I've done it.
We do it.
Yeah. The Miami HUD office has referred things to us as the state FAP. So it's, we've actually, with the Broward County Human Rights, also done what we call a FIP-FAP training. You sit down with one another, you talk about who does what in your organization, because you'd be surprised that you've been sitting and working in the same jurisdiction and you have no idea how either entity really works. So we get to meet the staff, they get to meet my staff, they get to know what we do, how it works, introduce our work to them, and then figure out how it all works together. So if you are in the same jurisdiction, figure out how you can have that meeting and do that cross-training for one another.
We have one more call-in question, and I think we have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and take it as the last, just because we've promised Q&A.
We have a call from Jennifer Jones. How does testing methodology evolve to take into consideration the new processes used to apply for apartments and loans, for example, online applications?
Never done that one.
What was the first part of what she said?
Online application.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, testing for
testing doesn't
online.
include application. We do pre-application testing. So I withdrew from the microphone.
Oh, okay.
So no social security numbers, et cetera, by our testers are ever given up. So
You do have to have a number of testers who will go through a full application process for you, because otherwise you're not going to find it out. So I could assume Kenya's financial background, as long as you trust me as a tester, to use her social security number and her other information, or she could do it on her own. But you have to advise your testers, you shouldn't be getting ready to buy a house, you shouldn't be getting ready to, go someplace else, because you're going to have hits on your credit report. The ideal thing, and we asked DOJ about this in HUD in the 1990s, is to create in the credit bureau system real false identities that we could use as testers. So we could do full lending application testing. And it wouldn't, you couldn't just get it. You'd have to be qualified through HUD and DOJ as a fair housing center that could be trusted to use those created identities that are in the credit bureau system. because we have to make that penetration into the system because they know that we're out here on the edge and they discriminate through the whole process.
Okay, we have hit the 5:15 mark, and you have been a remarkable audience. I want to thank the panelists, but also you for staying to the end and participating in this. And the last comment of, okay, round of applause for the panelists. And I appreciate where we got to, which was what's the next round of innovations that we need and pushing so that we really can make compelling evidence from either side on research or in enforcement testing so that we can move further on discrimination. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the National Fair Housing Training and Policy Conference. The conference will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. Doors will be open at 8 a.m. Just one note, for those of you planning to bring luggage with you tomorrow, as you plan to leave directly from here to go to the airport, just know that we do not have storage space. Well, we do not have a storage area, and we cannot be responsible for your luggage. Okay? Take care. Have a great evening. See you tomorrow morning.